Hey there, so you're here because you're hoping to learn how to paint this beautiful little turtle with a rainbow shell. So how about we get started? So there is a material list below that that has stuff that you'll need to be able to paint this guy. And what I'm going to start by doing is tracing this picture onto my watercolor paper. It's important that you use watercolor paper for this one in particular because it has a background. And if you're not doing a background, it's a little bit less important, but it's still helpful to have that lovely watercolor paper. So I'm just going to get a sheet of paper from my book. And what you will need for this is you'll need a flat surface that you can stick the piece of paper onto. So notice that he has a nice white border. This one's obviously bigger than the one I'm going to paint today for the video, just because it's a little bit easier to fit it on my screen on your screen if he's a bit smaller. But notice the nice white border. We want to have that. So the way we get that is either by using masking tape that we stick straight onto a flat surface. It won't work on a tablecloth or a table that's bumpy. It needs to be a flat surface. So if you don't have a table that is flat like mine is, what you can do is if you get your art book that has your paper in it, at the back there's a hard piece of card, and that's what I'm going to use today. So I can just get my piece of paper and stick the edges of my page down. And it's important that you do the whole way around the outside. So I'm going to get my tape and stick it half on my paper and half flapping off the edge. Okay, or if it's on the table, you'll just stick half of it onto the table. Half flapping off the edge, and then I'm going to fold it down over the edge of my cardboard. And I'm going to do that for all of the sides. Again, you could do it straight onto the table if you have a surface that is smooth. You want to try and make all of your edges nice and even. So that's why we go half on the table, half on the paper, or half on the cardboard and half on the paper. So get a nice and even border. The reason we do that is maybe you've experienced before when you've been painting with watercolors or even with acrylic paint where the paper has started to bend and what we call buckle. It's gotten too heavy and the paper's gone wavy like that. If we stick the edges down, that doesn't happen. And it helps us to have that lovely white border, which makes your artwork look so professional. So I've got my piece of paper with my border ready to go. And next I need my turtle outline and my special magic black paper. For the adults in the room, also known as graphite paper or carbon paper, sometimes transfer paper. Now this is one way to trace, and I have got another video that shows you another way to trace if you don't have a piece of this black paper or if you've thrown yours away. So what we need to do is we place our black shiny side down on our artwork, and then we put a little piece of tape just to keep it in place. We don't want to rub around too much when that's on there because it'll leave black marks that won't go away. Then I pop my turtle down wherever I want him to go. I'm going to paint this guy like that today. You can, of course, you can just do it straight. You might have a bigger piece of paper, so you might put him up on the corner, down, you know, anywhere you like. So, but I'm going to paint him like this today. And I just use some more sticky tape to make sure he or she doesn't move. And it doesn't have to be special, we don't want him to move, because what can happen if I start tracing and my page moves, I might end up with an eyeball over in his fin or an eyeball over in the ocean. We don't want that. We want his eyeball to be where his eyeball is meant to go, right? So I just trace around all of the outlines. Now, you might notice that our turtle has lots and lots and lots of dots all over his body. All these dots. You have two choices in the way you go about that. You can either trace them all and paint inside of them, but I actually find it easier to not trace them and instead just paint on dots when it comes time to do that in our artwork. Just paint them on randomly, because no two turtles are the same anyway, so you don't necessarily need to have those dots in the same place. Though I do find it helpful to draw on the patches on his shell, because they kind of do have a little bit of a similar pattern on most turtles, though they're not exactly the same either, I believe. So I am going to trace the shell part on, but I'm not going to trace all of the little parts on for the rest of his body. And the harder you press, if you're using graphite paper or magic black paper, sorry, the darker your outline will be. So you might like to press pretty light. And you want to try not to rub with this part of your hand if you can avoid it. And the magic black paper can be used over and over and over again. So it's a super helpful thing if you're not working on your drawing skills that day. Of course, if you're a clever drawer or you're working on your drawing skills, you want to get practice for those, you absolutely can freehand the turtle on. There's no problems with doing that. You might just draw your own turtle and use some of the techniques that we've got here to help you. Same thing with these lines. You might like to just leave those lines. You might like to draw them on. It's totally up to you. And I used a red pen to do this. It won't go red onto my artwork. It'll be black. But I've used a red pen because then I could know where I traced and where I haven't traced yet. And when I take the tape off this for the big reveal, it's probably going to look a little bit silly because he doesn't have all of the details on there. But like I said before, we're going to paint those on, so he won't look silly for long. So I'm just going to take this tape off now that I've traced my turtle. And if I'm not going at the same speed you need me to, you make sure you pause that video. Ta-da! And I have my turtle who looks a little bit odd because he hasn't got all of his detail. I've also missed these lines, but that's okay. I kind of didn't want those there anyways. So I'm just going to pop that off to the side. I need to be careful with this. If I get the tape off, I just want to try not to rip my black paper. And it's best, you can see the turtle in there, if you just fold it up, because otherwise you might get black all over things that you don't want black on. Just fold that up and put that away. All right. So I think it's almost time to start painting our turtle. What I like to do before I start painting, because this outline is really, really dark, I like to use my eraser just to make it a bit lighter, but it won't go away fully because it's not, the graphite paper isn't the same as pencil, so it won't rub out all the way. But just where I've rubbed the page with my hand a little bit, I like to try and rub those out if I can, and then just try and make these a bit lighter. Don't have to do that if you're happy enough with your outline. You can just leave it the way it is. And I'm noticing it's smudging a little bit because of the eraser that I've got, so I'm not going to worry about doing that much more. So, how do we paint the turtle? Now, what I want to say first of all is this is how I'm going to paint my turtle so that it looks just like this one here. You can paint your turtle however you want. You don't have to do a rainbow shell if you don't want to. You don't have to do the same colors that I'm doing, but this is just the way that I'm going to do it today. You can copy along exactly if you want. It's totally up to you. So the techniques we're going to use today are just all of the ones that you've had a bit of a look at in the warm-up video, which I hope you've done. So what I'm going to do first of all might be a bit different, so just have a bit of a watch. So I'm going to wet my paintbrush. scraping it around on the bottom so that I can see my paintbrush fills up with water. And I'm going to fill one of these little side wells. Okay, if you don't have this same paint palette, you can of course put just some water on a plate I like to use and add your paint to that little dollop of water. I'm doing that because I want to dilute the colour. I want to make it lighter, not so dark. And then I'm going to get some of this colour here. It's kind of like a really light yellowish brown. And I'm going to add that to that side well so that it's diluted, it's watered down. And then I'm going to paint that light brown over the entire turtle, over his fins, over his face. The only place you might like to avoid it is inside his eyeball. You might like to skip that area, but if you actually have a look at turtles, most of their eye is coloured anyway. So I'm going to not worry about that. I'm just going to paint there. So I'm popping that light brown colour, light brown wash it's called, over my whole turtle, shell and all. And if my colour's a bit dark, I can always add some more water just from my water jar over that turtle. Add some more paint. I don't really need to go outside of my turtle's body. If you accidentally go outside of the lines, it doesn't really matter. It's just paper at the end of the day, isn't it? But also, it doesn't matter particularly if you are going to do a background. And you don't have to. You can leave your turtle without a background if you're happy enough with him just floating through white space. You might do a different background to what I've got as well. It's totally up to you. So my turtle now has a layer of brown over all of him. Now, if you can remember from our previous video, the warm-up, we don't want to paint the next layer yet because it will bleed everywhere. If I try and paint some of these shell patches, now what will happen is the paint will go out into the gaps, which I don't want to happen. So I'm going to use my heat gun to dry this off. You might need to pause the video and wait till your turtle isn't shiny anymore. My turtle is still shiny. That's how I know he's wet. Or you might like to, with some adult help, use a hairdryer to dry that off. I'm going to use my heat gun. He's all dry. Hooray. So now I am going to paint the shell. Now, inside all of these patches is a skill that you hopefully practiced in the warm-up video. I'm just gonna grab my little warm-up sheet here to remind you. So it's that gradient there. And I am just gonna show you that again, just in case you missed it. So just wet a space, and we're gonna go from one color on one side to another color by putting the color on one side and then the other color on the other side of that, and then in the middle just mixing them kind of together. Okay, you can wet your brush and dry it off on your paper towel and mix those together if you've got a lot of water already, and then as they dry they'll be lovely and blended. Okay, so that's the skill that we're going to use to do the whole shell. So I like to start here in this spot, and I start by painting just some water inside just the part where I am painting. So see, that's shiny. That's how I know that it's wet enough. And I'm going to start with this kind of red here on one side of his shell, one side of that wet space. I'm going to wet my paintbrush, dry it off, and do the other color that I'm working towards on the other side of that patch. Dry it off. Now, I'm actually going to continue doing that same type of color on these next ones here, just down the bottom. So I'm actually going to work and do a couple of wet spaces all at once. You can do one at a time if that works for you, or you can do a few at once as well. It's totally up to you. So I've wet those 4 there, 1, 2, 3, 4. They're all wet, and I'm going to add my red down the bottom of each of those. Red down the bottom of each of those. And then clean my brush off, dry it off a little bit, collect some of my orange and add it to the other side or the top of those patches. It doesn't matter if the red and the orange touch because we want them to blend together anyways. And then I can clean my brush off, dry it off a bit, and then just where it's joining, I can just move that around a bit with my brush, do little circles, do little stripes. Use my brush kind of like a mop, and that's that layer done. I like to wet all of the parts, the patches on the shell that are going to be the same kind of color. So the next layer I'm going to do is going from yellow to green. Although that's different to what I've done over there. Actually orange to yellow. So I'm going to change my mind and go orange to yellow. So I've got these two here and they start orange. They start orange, make that a little bit darker. And then they go to yellow on the other side. Just using my brush to mix those. Notice I didn't clean it off in between or wet it. Because I had my yellow and it was quite wet, I didn't really need to wet it in between. And because I'm not trying to go from colors that are very, very, very different from each other, it doesn't necessarily matter if you forget to wash them off every time. So next I go from yellow to green. Wet these three. Yellow down the bottom. Up to a green of my choice. Which green do I want to use? Keep touching this one. Maybe I'll go with this one, hey? Up to green. Oh, that's nice. Okay, I'm just topping that in there. The reason I'm not blending that in yet is because I've got quite a lot of green on my brush and I think it's going to be too much. So I'm cleaning my brush off and drying it off. And then I'm just going to move that green and yellow around to mix them a little bit together where they join. Then this last one at the top here is blue. So I'm going to paint this section. I'm going to start with this colour here because that colour there, oh no I'm not, sorry I changed my mind. I'm going to start with this colour here and go from here up to a blue. The reason I picked this colour is because it's kind of in between green and blue. And I thought that would look nice. There we go, that's half of our shell done. That was pretty quick, wasn't it? Maybe you're not as quick as I am, but that's okay. You can go as slow or as fast as you need to. Get my brush, wet it again. Go over to this side. Now, I kind of made a little bit of a mistake because I've put green here, and I actually want this side of the shell to go down to a purple and blue. So what I'm going to do, and you don't have to, you can go from green back to blue down to purple if you like, but I'm actually going to get my paper towel and put it over the top of that area there just to pick that color up, because I actually don't want it to be green. I'm just going to paint that blue into a purple. And then I'm going to go back. So I used my paper towel then, just like an eraser. Then I'm going to start these ones here as, paint these ones all wet. Now, some of you might be wondering, why don't I just paint all of the patches wet to start with? You could do that if you like. Maybe you're really quick at painting. But what might happen is they might dry, and you might then think that they're wet and just start painting on them and they're not quite wet enough. And so you'd have to wet them again. So it's totally up to you. You can do that. So I'm going to start with purple up here in my wet sections. Over here, I'm just gonna leave that one there. So now I'm gonna go from purple to pink. Purple to pink. Now here, the reason I left that is because it goes from green to purple. And that might be okay, you might be happy to do that, but I actually want it to go and look a little bit like a smoother transition to that. So I'm actually going to use a this color here, and I'm going to paint a little bit of that there. Then I'm going to go a little bit of blue. And then I'm going to put a little bit of purple. So then it kind of blends in a little bit more over to this side. And down here at the bottom of my pink, I'm actually going to get a darker shade of pink and add in that as a third color. Now, if that's a bit too tricky, you don't have to do that. You can just go straight down to pink the whole way. Remember, it's your turtle, so you can paint it however you like. Okay, so then I've got these last ones down here that I'm going to go back to this color. Oh, no, I haven't wet them yet. So wet those patches. Being careful not to make puddles, because if you make puddles, the water might overflow out of those little patches. I'm going to start with that lovely pink that I had before. Some of them might be a bit too small to fit two colours in. We shall find out. Putting that at the top there. And I'm going to go into a reddish kind of pink colour for mine. Not a very obvious change, so I might make that a little bit darker. That's that first red that I started with. So we end up back where we started. I'm just having a look at this one here going, oh yes, that's purple at the top there. So I'm gonna actually go to purple, back to that red color. And then this one is green down to the, it's kind of yellow really, isn't it? Here we go. That is our shell done. So We don't necessarily need to dry off our turtle anymore to continue working on him. We can start painting our browns on now, on his fins and his face, because that area is already dry. But what I would suggest is not painting this fin just yet, because it does touch these. You might accidentally lean on the wet bits and make stamps all over your page. So I'm going to start on this fin here. That brown. So that brown there is this brown, but watered down. So just like we did at the start there, I'm going to add some of that brown over to the side and water it down a fair bit. If I get my paintbrush and I feel like I've got too much water on there, I just tap the end of it onto my paper towel so that it's not quite so wet. And remember, you might be filling in the little shapes that you made, but I am doing them freehand. So I'm looking at that brown and I'm going, oh, that's a little bit too watered down. So I'm just adding some more of my color by scraping my brush around in there and popping it off to the side and tapping it on there because I don't want it too wet. Yes, that's better. I'm just painting the shapes quite big on this section. I don't really want them to be perfect squares or anything like that. I just want them to be rectangular-ish. And I want them to kind of get a bit smaller as they go along the fin. They go up around here. And even if you've traced them, you might find that where there's a gap, I'll show you what I mean. So there's a gap here, but there's dots in this space here when I've painted the turtle. So you might still freehand some dots in, or you might leave it blank. It's up to you. These ones here are a little bit longer if you are freehanding them. Like I said before, though, it doesn't matter. It's not a exact science. We're just giving the impression of a turtle here, aren't we? So it doesn't need to be perfect. I'm just going to go in and add just some dots by touching my paintbrush very lightly on to my fin there. Now, if you are freehanding your turtle spots on, probably the hardest part to do will be his face, but not so hard that it's impossible, just a bit tricky. I like to start down here and go up around like that. Go a bit further down actually, and then over this side it's kind of like a bit around like that. Some small dots in there, bigger one up through here. My paintbrush is just wet enough to have some paint on there. If I notice my colour's getting too light, which we're starting to get to, I'm just going to collect a little bit of that on my paintbrush again. Where the paint is already wet on my page, I can add that in because it's wet. Remember, it'll bleed out. I want to fill that in a bit more, I think. Just doing all sorts of random patches to fill in this space. Remember, no two turtles are the same, so they don't have to be, there's no exactness to it. And then his eyeball is actually a little bit brown in the sides of it. He has got a bit of an eyebrow. Yeah. He's looking a bit silly at the moment. And I'll tell you what, if you ever paint something and it feels a bit silly, it's probably the eyeball. He hasn't got an eyeball yet, but we can't paint that on until this area is all dry. Now, I'm just having a bit of a look. I can see that some of my shell is still wet. This part here does seem to be dry. So if I'm careful, I can twist my artwork if it's not stuck to the table, and I can paint inside his fin, or I can paint inside this back fin. I'm gonna paint inside this back fin because I really do want this to be quite dry before I lean on that space. And that way I can show you what it would look like even if I did have this stuck to the table. So I'm just getting my same paint on there. And again, just freehanding on some of those little spots or patches of brown onto his back fin. It didn't take long to do that one because it's quite a small fin. Okay, now we're ready to do this fin here. Now, the way I do this so that I'm not leaning on my artwork, so I just want to be careful in case it's not fully dry. So I point my pinky out like this, really fancy like, and I kind of use that to stabilize my hand, so that my actual palm of my hand or the side of my hand here isn't really actually leaning on my artwork at all. I'm just putting in those shapes, wanting them all to be a little bit different from each other, just to create interest in my artwork. Different sizes, different shapes. Again, if you've got an outline there, you just fill in those spaces. Big long one down there. Lots of smaller ones towards this base. A bit longer leading up to here. A bit more spotty on this side. There we go, I think that fin's done. Okay, he's still missing some work there for the brown. So this line here is actually so that we know to paint some brown on the underside of his belly. And the brown that I'm going to use is this same brown that I've created on the side, but I'm actually going to dilute it a bit more because I want it to be quite light. Okay, so I'm diluting that by adding some water to it, making a big well of it. I'm going to tap a bit of it off onto my paper towel, and then I'm going to paint that on under this belly part here. Notice it's quite light. I'm going to paint another line just here. Now, he doesn't necessarily need these. It's just to add a little bit of shadow. So we painted a line just here, starting at the corner of that line and then moving up there. And then over here, we're painting the same kind of line on the belly side. Now, I've got some really light stripes here around there. Okay, there's about 4 of them. I've just gone over them twice so you definitely see 4 of those really light stripes. And I've also got some that go over to here. Now these are a bit darker on my original, my reference that I'm looking at. So I've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 little stripes there. You don't have to do quite so many if you don't want. That's how many I've got there. And then I've also got some dots that go up here for his patch. And they are a bit darker again. So I'm going to collect some of that darker brown that I've made over there. And I'm going to pop some of those dots in over here. Now I can get really small dots by only just touching my paper with my paintbrush. Okay, he's almost done. He's still looking a little bit funny though. And it's because he's missing that eyeball. Now I've just touched mine. It's definitely dry, but you must make sure that your eyeball is definitely dry before you paint the black on. Otherwise the whole thing will end up black, which, you know, I guess isn't the end of the world, but it does look better if it's a little bit not black all over perhaps. So you've got a couple of choices here. You might feel like it's easier for you to actually go and get a black pen and color in his eyeball using a pen. There's no rules saying you aren't allowed to do that. You absolutely can do that if that makes you feel like you're gonna get it inside that line, because it is such a small space. You can also use the little paintbrush, like a little paintbrush that you've got. It might be easier, or you can just use a really small amount of pressure using your big paintbrush. I am going to use a smaller paintbrush just for this section, sorry, because my eyeball is really small because my whole turtle is quite small. So I'm painting inside that circle or the pupil, and it doesn't matter if you can't do this, it's not a big deal, but it does look pretty cool if you can leave the center of your pupil white, because it means it looks like then that he's actually looking somewhere. So that, I've just gone outside of the lines there, but I'm just going to make his pupil a bit bigger and it won't actually matter. That is our turtle, and you might decide, this is up to you, you might decide he's finished, or you might like to go in, get some of that brown on your paintbrush, and you might like to go over those lines to hide some of that outline that you've done. You might like to use a pen to do that instead, like a black felt tip pen or something. You might actually just leave it. It's totally up to you. I am going to use my paintbrush to give it a little bit of an outline here. Doesn't matter as much around the edges because I am going to add a background, but if you're not, you might like to add that around the edges. And I'm actually going to also add just a darker line over the top of those and over a couple of these here. But that's not compulsory, it's not mandatory. It'll look good even if you don't do that. Some nostrils there. And that is my turtle done. And you might like to just leave it like that. You might not want to add a background. It's your artwork. If you don't want a background, you absolutely don't have to have a background. But I am going to show you how to do a background, just like this one. So this one here has water, and it also has this space here, which is meant to look like a blurry kind of coral reef. So how do we do that? So we have to make sure our turtle is so dry. He has to be 100% dry. So you might like to pause the video and come back when your turtle is dry, or you might like to use your hairdryer, or if you've got a heat gun, you can use that. I'm going to use this. So we don't want any shiny bits whatsoever. Okay, so this is a good opportunity for you to get some clean water if your water is quite brown like mine is, because we're going to be putting water over the whole, not the whole page, because we don't want it over our turtle, but the whole background. We want it all to be wet. We want to use that wet on wet technique. So I'm just going to get some fresh water. Ta-da! And then what I need to do is I actually need to work a little bit quickly now to get this done, because I need my background to stay really wet the whole time I'm working on it. So what I'm going to do is get my paintbrush. If you have a bigger paintbrush, like a big flat paintbrush, that can be helpful, or you might have access to a mop. This is even better. Or you might have this, but I'm just going to use my normal old paintbrush because that's usually what most people have available to them, especially if you're just a little person. So I've got my paintbrush, I'm swishing it around a lot, moving it around, brushing it on the bottom to fill it up with water. I'm not going to get any of that water off, and I'm going to wet that whole space, only being careful around the turtle, because I don't want to wet my turtle, just I want to wet near him, but not on top of him. Dip my paintbrush back in, wet, wet, wet. Wet the whole thing. Going up to the edges of my turtle, but not touching, not on him or her. Wet. Lots of water. Okay, all the way around, wet, wet, wet. We may need to re-dampen some of the space that we first started with. And we may need to re-wet some of these spaces as we go on, depending on how slowly or how quickly we're able to fill these spaces in with paint. And we want it to be wet all over, because then the water, we won't have stripes in our water, we'll have smooth looking water. Okay, so that's wet all over. I'm just gonna add a little bit more water to the side where I first started. Wet all over, and then I'm gonna pick my blue. I'm gonna pick this one today, paint that over the whole thing. And because my space is wet, you might notice that the paint actually moves around quite easily as well, because it's naturally just bleeding, which is what we want to happen anyways. Paint right up to the edge. Be nice and careful when you get close to the edge of your turtle. Okay, you might like to just do water over the whole thing. Paint the whole thing as water, not do coral reef. Or you might like to do coral reef over the whole thing. That's okay as well. If you are going to do coral reef over the whole thing, then probably don't start with the water there. I'm going to paint some blue just over the top here, because that's not where I've got coral reef. Just moving this around to make it easier, but mostly because I'm on video. But if I had it stuck to the table, I actually wouldn't need to move around. I'd just stand up and do it. So I'm just painting water everywhere coral reef isn't going to be. Okay, so water, and I'm painting all the way to the edge of my turtle, but not over the top of my turtle. Okay, all right, now I've left this white because I'm going to paint coral reef there. What I want to do is make sure that's nice and wet to do my coral reef. Just making sure that I've got enough water there. Yep, that's nice and shiny. Except there it's not shiny. I mustn't have put enough water. Okay, so coral reef. Your coral reef can be any color you like. I'm going to start with some orange. And all I'm going to do is touch my page, make kind of like cloud shapes. I might go some out, do some more orange over here, Then I'm going to pick a different color and do the same thing. I'm going to pick this color. Touch, touch, touch. Doesn't matter if you overlap because we want them to blend together a bit. Just being careful not to touch not to go over my turtle. I'm going to use some of this lovely color because how could I not? Just love that color. I think it's beautiful. I'm going to pick some yellow now. And I pretty much want to just fill in all the spaces. They can, like I said, they can overlap. Doesn't matter if they touch because we want them to be just filled in everywhere. We want it to be all coral reefy. Not over the top of our turtle because we want our turtle to be in front of our coral reef, not behind it. And if we paint the coral reef over the top of our turtle, then it looks like he's actually underneath the coral reef. And I'll put some more of that color there, I think. I'm gonna just continue it. You can go over the top of the blue that you painted already, by the way. That doesn't matter. Might do a bit of orange there, I think. Just figuring out what's gonna go nicely next to the top of my shell here because I don't want it to be the same color. I just want it to stand out a bit. I've ended up putting some blue there. You can go back and put some blue over the top in some spaces if you like, just to tie it all together. Okay, so something that's happened here that I want to tell you about. See here, it's a bit of a puddle. It's a bit too much water. So I'm just going to use my paper towel just to pick some of that up like it's a sponge. I don't want it to accidentally overflow onto the top of my turtle. I'm just using the very tip of my brush to paint up next to the turtle. Just going to add in some of that green here. I think that'll look a bit better than the yellow that I've put there. But being careful because if I mix the colours too much, I'll end up looking brown. Which, you know, coral reefs have brown, so there's nothing against brown. You might like to put brown. If it's not bright enough in some of those spaces, you can go back and put some more dots of the same colour over the top as well. If you've put too much of one colour, you can also use your paintbrush to mop it up. So I'm just going in with a dry paintbrush by drying it off with my paper towel and then picking that up. And that's my turtle. The last thing you have to do is the big reveal. And the big reveal is taking off the sticky tape. But what you need to do before you do that is you need to dry it off. So I'm going to use my handy heat gun again. Remember, you can just wait or you can use a hairdryer, but with some help of an adult if you're doing that. So I'm going to dry this off with my heat gun. think that'll do. So now I just peel my tape off. I'm trying to be careful not to rip my paper. If it is ripping your paper, you can always use your hairdryer or heat gun to heat up the sticky tape and melt the glue a little bit as you go. Oh, doesn't that look lovely with the white border? How good is that? And that is your rainbow turtle. Well, he's a bit special if you ask me. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. And if you did, please let me know.